It was the middle of a hot summer in the blossoming young city of Portland, Oregon. The proprietors of a business near the waterfront found a note on their premises. Penned in red ink, the author noted the fact that the business in question had employed Chinese immigrants and posed a vague, non-specific threat against them if they did not make a change. In the note, they gave the business 2 to 3 weeks to remove any and all Chinese persons from employment. Or else. Or else what? Nobody knows for certain. It was 1873. Portland was a young city, but a young city on the move. While dwarfed in comparison to other coastal cities like San Francisco at the time, Portland actually boasted a larger population than Los Angeles. A city with its origins stemming from travelers along the Oregon Trail starting in the 1840s, this area, originally referred to as Stumptown, and the clearing, due to all the trees that were chopped down to allow for its development, Portland officially became a city in 1851. For those who don't know the famous story of Portland's origin, 2 early settlers who owned much of the land in the area, Francis Pettygrove and Asa Lovejoy, had a coin toss to decide the city's name. Pettygrove wanted to name it after his hometown of Portland, Maine, and Lovejoy wanted to name it after his hometown of Boston, Massachusetts. Pettygrove obviously won the toss. And with that, the city took off, with a population increasing by almost 190% from 1860 to 1870. A clearing, with a mix of cabins and simple wood structures, had expanded to multi-story homes, commercial buildings, and charming hotels. Namely, the St. Charles Hotel that stood along Front and Morrison. It was, as you could probably guess, a booming port city, and it was surrounded by beauty in all directions. But for all of the city's blossoming and surface beauty, it was countered by an underlying seediness. Rampant alcoholism, ongoing crime, and a general sense of clutter and dirtiness were all over the town. In a city of barely over 10,000 inhabitants, there had been over 1,600 arrests conducted by the police. Many of the buildings down by the river were cluttered by discarded items and trash, and of course, rampant racism. But trust me, we'll be getting back to that. Many buildings in town were either wood or cast iron structures, easily susceptible to fires. The city was a little more than naive when it came to being prepared for a fire to break out. They had a single fire bell in town to go with a few volunteer fire companies. Yes, Portland's firefighting capabilities consisted strictly of volunteers. You probably see where I'm going with all of this. It was the dead of night. A police officer walking his beat near the intersection of Southwest 1st and Salmon noticed a light in the darkness of the building at the southeast corner of that intersection, which housed the Hergren and Schindler furniture store. Almost as quickly as he noticed the light, the officer realized it was actually the flicker of a flame. Thinking quickly, the officer screamed that there was a fire, a factor critical in clearing people out of that immediate area. The bell rang, alerting the fire companies, who also reacted quickly. However, as quickly as they tried to act, these companies were countered by one critical factor. The Hergren and Schindler store was full of items such as oils, waxes, and varnishes. The building was consumed by flames by the time the firefighters arrived on the scene. And this, my friends, is where it all started. This is the intersection of 1st Avenue and Salmon Street. And I'm standing on the southeast corner of that intersection. And behind me in 1873, there was a furniture store located right here. And at approximately 4:30 a.m. I just saw Joanne Hardesty, County Commissioner, over there, and it threw me. Start over. And so a bell started ringing through the city. That was kind of the way of signaling the volunteer fire departments that there was a fire going on. The hopes of containing the flames to this one structure fell apart when it became clear how dangerous the expansion of the fire truly was. One firefighter, a Thomas Lawson, as he climbed a ladder to the 2nd floor, found himself blown to the ground by a sudden blast from within the building. This was not going to be an easy containment. It was also the dead of summer, and even in the middle of the night, a brisk, warm wind was blowing through town, only helping the fire as it spread. A carpentry business and foundry on the same block as the furniture store provided even more kindling and fuel to the fire, helping it spread. And with a wind coming in from the south blowing things north, flames did manage to pretty much leapfrog Salmon Street as well as 1st. So it leaped over to this side of the street, which is the north side of Salmon. More specifically, the northwest corner of Salmon and NATO Parkway, which would have been Front Avenue. And where this structure stands today, this is where the Metropolis Hotel was located. And the Metropolis Hotel was almost entirely a wood structure. So as the flames crossed over Salmon Street and hit that hotel, they said that hotel was completely demolished to rubble inside of 15 minutes. As quickly as the fire leaped over Salmon Street, any hope of stopping this conflagration was gone. With only so many fighters, they could only cover a fire of a certain size. Anything beyond that was practically hopeless. Emergency requests were quickly sent out to any other companies nearby. Multiple companies came down the Willamette River on the steamer Onetta from Vancouver, Washington, making it in about 75 minutes. In a remarkable accomplishment for the time, a crew from Salem, some 53 miles south of the fire, managed to make it by train in only 58 minutes. Numerous other companies came to help, but no matter how many joined, this fire was not going to be stopped. Their first great effort to attack the fire occurred as it spread north, burning through Taylor Street and up towards Yamhill Street. The fire was also moving east towards the Willamette River. Some firefighters were knee-deep in the river's water as they took on the flames. This particular area was also the city's primary Chinatown before it ultimately moved north of Burnside Street. With numerous Chinese immigrants in the area, many of them were forced, under the threat of violence, to help combat the fire. To no surprise, these people faced the most danger in assisting the firefighting efforts. Many of the Chinese immigrants in the area had to stand in the small space between the river and the buildings that were burning right along the river. Had any of these buildings collapsed, there would have been numerous casualties. The intensity of the heat from the flames was so strong that these people had to be sprayed down frequently. As the attack was on to stall the fire from continuing to process northward, complete panic had broken out in the streets. In an effort to save what they could, people threw personal items out into the street. These items lined the streets as far west as 8th Avenue, some 9 blocks back from the Willamette River. Despite this being done to save their possessions, many of them were either trampled by people fleeing the scene or those trying to help with the fire. Other possessions eventually caught fire anyway. As barges approached the shoreline of the river, some were lucky enough to throw their belongings onto them, keeping them safe. But these were limited few. Amidst this chaos, every block running between 2nd Avenue and the river going east and west, and between Main and Yamhill Streets going north and south, were almost completely destroyed. And there was still so many structures north of there that were in immediate danger, namely the St. Charles Hotel. The hotel was a significant landmark for the city, a place that the Oregonian had called the most magnificent structure on the northwest Pacific coast. With the fire burning less than a block away from that hotel, the primary focus of firefighters became to save that building. Blankets were hung out the windows and sprayed with water in the ultimately successful effort in saving the hotel. And by saying saving the hotel, it still sustained damages to the tune of $10,000, a lot of money in 1873. This action, however, was not without controversy, as the attitude seemed to be that other structures nearby were insignificant compared to this grand hotel, and thus, as the hotel was successfully saved, it was at the cost of several other buildings, businesses, and homes. And again, a great number of structures in this area were either homes or businesses that belonged to Chinese immigrants. With the attitude of the times, it should be no surprise then that the firefighters willingly allowed their structures to burn. While the fire did continue to burn north, across Yamhill to Morrison Street, it only did so between Front Avenue and the river, where it ultimately burned out. This is as far north as the fire would burn. The reason the fire stopped spreading north at this point was due primarily to 4 different factors. One was the concentrated effort made to save the St. Charles Hotel. 2, elements of the buildings standing along Yamhill Street, such as inflammable awnings, gave the flames less to burn and stalled them enough to keep them from leaping across another street. 3, as the flames reached this general area, it seems the warm summer winds had begun to shift, turning more in a southern direction, good for the immediate area, but not so great for the buildings south of the fire. And 4, well, reason 4 is just a wild piece of irony. Remember, the flames had still burned beyond Yamhill Street down by the river. How were those flames stopped? So as practically everything within view of here was getting completely destroyed by flames, this was kind of the point where firefighters were beginning to hold off the fire. And you can see, I mean, downtown goes on so much further. So much more could have been destroyed. However, while they were holding here, the structures that were still located here between Front Avenue and the river were still burning beyond Yamhill and up towards Morrison Street, which would be the next block. So there was still concern as fire continued to burn north through this area that of course is just Waterfront Park. However, in a strange twist of fate, the advancement of these flames that could have continued burning buildings up and down the waterfront and possibly started moving back into the city, even as the flames were being slowed here. Oddly enough, it was another tragedy that happened only about a little less than 9 months earlier that was able to prevent the flames burning through here from continuing to advance north. This will probably be a good time to tell you the story of the Great Portland Fire of 1872. So I am approaching the Morrison Bridge going off, and lots of old buildings used to be in here that were demolished so that they could have this big off-ramp from Morrison Street. But of course this wasn't always here. Morrison used to be down towards the ground. And this is the block where the fire of 1873 was continuing to advance north, even though it was beginning to get held over here. However, December 22nd, 1872, not even a year earlier, and also conveniently in the middle of the night, much like this fire, there was along Front Avenue, which again would be Nadeau Parkway here, it was on the east side of Front between Morrison, which kind of wraps around and goes down there, and Alder, which goes around there. So right in here, in the vicinity of this off-ramp, there, pardon the sirens, there's something going down, but right in this area, there would have been a building that was described as a Chinese laundromat. And in the middle of the night, a fire was noticed beginning to spark along the backside of the building. So, you know, somewhere in this area. And that fire quickly began to spread. Now, a lot of issues helped the spread of this fire. And some of those elements applied to the 1873 fire, such as the fact that the fire department, there was no firmly established full-time fire department. It was 5 volunteer groups that each had their own kind of firehouse in the area, but like most of them didn't even have horses to pull their, you know, carriage with their big water tank on them, as it were. So reaction time could only be so quick. But in particular, down here along the waterfront, because there were, you know, buildings used to stretch all the way to the river. And a lot of these people that had businesses down here, they stored a lot of trash and random stuff in between and kind of under the buildings. They would just kind of store a bunch of stuff, which were all, you know, flammable. And in addition to this trash, in this general area that's said to be along Alder Street to the river, there was conveniently a massive lumber yard here. So the fire started, it spread quick because it was burning through a lot of, you know, these buildings that were wood structures. They had all this trash around them that just fueled the fire. And it started burning, and within 30 minutes, pretty much from the vicinity of the bridge overpass here to just a little ways this way, maybe 50, 100 feet that way, everything that was here had been completely destroyed. And once the fire reached the lumber yard, I mean, it just sparked even more. And one of the benefits of that fire, as opposed to the fire of 1873, was the fact that it was December. It was only 3 days before Christmas. So while there was a wind that helped spread this fire to hit lumber and all this stuff, as the day wore on, the winds died down and it started to rain. And that rain was instrumental in helping slow the fire. And then by nightfall, it snowed that night, which was probably, so those factors really helped in the effort to fight this building. And I hate to say fortunately, when you talk about people's livelihoods being destroyed, but unlike the 1873 fire, this one could have been catastrophic, astronomical, to the extent that the 1873 fire was. But in the end, it really only burned essentially 4 blocks. It burned pretty much everything from the waterfront to First Avenue, which there's some older buildings kind of lining over here. That's First Avenue. And then from Alder, which I believe are from Washington. So actually Washington will be more over here. So from Washington to Morrison, everything kind of through here all got completely destroyed, but it could have burned so much worse. And with the fact that the 1873 fire happened in August, it hadn't even been 9 full months since the 1872 fire. As the fire continued to burn north between Yamhill and Morrison, once it got to Morrison, this place was still vacant and burned out from the 1872 fire. So by the time the fire reached Morrison, between Front and the river, there was nothing here to burn. So, they would report it in newspapers in 1873. The 1872 fire actually successfully stopped the advancement of the 1873 fire. It created a 2-block buffer zone, and there was just nothing here to burn. So it helped, in addition to the firefighters trying to help stop it between Front and Second, around Yamhill, it had to stop here because it didn't have anything to fuel it to go on any further. So in a weird, twisted way, the 1872 fire may have prevented substantial further catastrophe in the 1873 fire. As quickly as the fire had burned out to the north of its origin, the wind shift kept the fire burning strong heading south. While there was considerably more destruction south of the fire's origin at First and Salmon, the information regarding this portion of the fire is considerably less than the blocks that burned north of there. I wonder if the reason behind this is that most of the area burned south was mostly residential, thus less damaging to the city in a commercial and financial sense. This served to minimize the fact that hundreds of homes were destroyed. While some ran around manic, others could do little more than sit on the city's curbstones and watch their worlds burn. It was reported, and possibly the most 1870s Portland thing ever, that several husbands just abandoned their wives and children to go to local saloons and drink their sorrows away. As with the effort to save the St. Charles, the primary focus of firefighters as they attacked the southern moving flames was to save the Smith Brothers Steam and Sawmill at the mouth of Clay Street along the Willamette River. As the location was surrounded by flames with many flare-ups on the property, the mill was successfully saved, but again, at what cost to other structures in the area? And unfortunately, just 3 years later, almost to the day, the Smith Brothers site was destroyed by a fire. A fire company house also perished in this area, along Madison Street. Reportedly, one firefighter, instead of fleeing the company house, stayed inside to ring the bell there. This lasted until the flames completely engulfed the building, with the heat snapping the rope leading to the bell. But as the fire burned through several blocks heading south, it never advanced west of 2nd Street, and as it reached Jefferson Street, 3 blocks south of the place of origin, the fire did start to die out. 2 important factors that it is believed helped stop the southern moving flames were, 1, the warm winds that had blown for hours began to fade, and 2, there was just less, structurally speaking, for the fire to burn. With it being smaller buildings and residences, this area was less dense than areas to the north. Reportedly, Dense foliage in the area around Clay Street, where the flames stopped, seemed to have served as something of a fire block. When all was said and done, more than 20 blocks of the city had been completely destroyed, reduced to ash. While granted, without a bit of luck, this fire could have destroyed pretty much the whole city. The argument had been made that the fire was more devastating to the city of Portland than the Great Boston Fire of 1872 and even the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 had been to those cities. Amidst the utter destruction that stretched for blocks, there were a few structures that, as if by magic, managed to withstand the inferno that bombarded the city for a day. Aside from the St. Charles, the Northrop, Blossom, and Fitch building managed to evade destruction. Built in 1858, it still stands today. And even more remarkable was the Wakefield and Glen building that stood at the southeast corner of 1st and Yamhill. Completely surrounded by rubble, this structure not only survived, but came away almost entirely unscathed. To its immediate right stood the Pearn and Poppleton buildings, which were destroyed in the fire. However, these structures would be rebuilt afterward, using some of the iron of those original buildings. And those buildings also still stand to this day.
So there was a church, a congregational church, that was very heavily photographed. Well, I shouldn't say heavily, but I mean, it's the 1870s. There's not a lot of imagery in relation to this fire. And this popped up in at least 2 or 3 pictures. And it was this congregational church that literally the whole block across the street from it burned. In fact, this is the block that would have been across the street from it. So there was these very harrowing images of just this little church standing tall, surrounded by rubble. And that church was located along 2nd Avenue here, between Jefferson Street and Madison Street. So it would have been standing right here, pretty much where these 2 gated, entry points are. That would have been, the congregational church would have just been standing right here. And the congregational church was one of just a few buildings of prominence or significance that managed to miss being burned down.
What was most remarkable about the whole ordeal were the reports that nobody died as a result of this great conflagration. Now, considering the level of embarrassment the city was going to face after this fire for multiple reasons, all of which will be discussed later, I'm very suspicious of this notion that nobody died. I feel like that may have been the city trying to save face, again, for how embarrassed they were going to be in multiple aspects related to this. And also, there's evidence, documented newspaper evidence, that there may have been deaths related to this fire. The August 14, 1873 edition of the Morning Oregonian reported that a Samuel Lowenstein of the legal firm of Lowenstein & Company was killed during the fire. In trying to find further verification for this, I found another reference to Lowenstein, stating that he had been struck and hurt by a falling hook and that he might die. Whether or not anyone actually died that day, there strangely was one death that occurred the day after the fire. A German man, only referenced by the name of Rivenstein, after assisting in fighting the fire, went down by the river to get into his boat and cross over to the east side of the river. In his efforts, he accidentally slipped and fell into the river and drowned. His body was found the following day. While the lack of a loss of life was one of few positives to come of this great fire, many who were directly affected by it only lived on to have to completely rebuild their lives. While the figures fluctuated based on the source, the most likely figure representing total losses from the fire amounted to almost $1,283,000. And that's 1873 money. And of that amount, only about $258,000 worth was covered by insurance, amounting to only about 20% of the total losses. Business owners not only lost their buildings, but also all of their goods inside, with no money to recover with. Multiple hotels, taverns, mills, and factories were lost. Even more tragic were all the families who fled their homes, having to leave everything behind. They lost their homes and everything they owned. Some, no doubt, lost their jobs and everything they had in that one day. While local churches and any other places that could help managed to provide temporary housing and food for those most destitute after the fire, a piece published in a newspaper blew back against claims that some people were not getting the help they needed. I do seriously question whether everyone was getting the help that they needed. The simple fact of the matter was that the victims of the fire needed financial help, and they needed it quick. Numerous places all across the country offered financial assistance in getting locals back on their feet. While a deceptive piece was posted in local papers, claiming such was not the case, the city's mayor, Henry Failing, refused any assistance from outsiders. His attitude was that Portland was still booming, and despite this setback, it was capable of raising itself out of the ashes. To him, Portland was a, quote, rich city that did not need outside charity. So, some things just don't change. While people were struggling and desperate, the mayor was too busy playing PR games. The joke may very well have been on the mayor himself, as in 1875, he lost in his re-election bid for mayor. While multiple factors likely played a part in all of this, some believe hostilities against Mayor Failing after rejecting outside help was a significant factor in this unexpected loss. Furthermore, While Portland had been blossoming economically, by the time of the fire, leading to the easy presumption that recovery on its own was possible, that very year saw the Panic of 1873 spark a nationwide depression. So much for a rich city climbing out of the ashes on its own. So many were left on their own to recover, in particular, the hundreds of local Chinese immigrants whose plight was paid little mind by the city as a whole. And if this aftermath wasn't bad enough, there was a smallpox outbreak that had started before the fire. The existence of this outbreak was known about, but kept from the public. A spike in smallpox cases was noticed after the fire, suggesting many people contracted it as crowds ran amok in the streets. This increase in smallpox cases was most notable among Chinese immigrants. Like other instances that made the city look bad in the aftermath of this great conflagration, newspapers posted articles claiming that such an outbreak did not exist. Of course, a city that could not afford to lose business and tourism, especially at this time, would have had a vested interest in keeping outsiders from thinking there was a widespread smallpox epidemic going on in Portland. While the onset of the Panic of 1873, which caused severe delay in doing exactly what Portland wanted to do, which was to rebuild on the land that had become rubble, the central hub of the city's commerce began moving inward from the waterfront. Many who wanted to rebuild on the rubble didn't even have the resources to do so. A flood in 1876 damaged what little progress had been made in that area to that point. It would not be until around 1878 before the redevelopment on this site finally took off. This explains why the oldest buildings still standing where the fire occurred primarily date back to the period of time between 1878 and 1882.
And I'm literally just going to walk you through the architecture that came along after the fire, the beauty that managed to rise up out of the ashes. This here is Mikado Block, and it stands at the northwest corner of First and Taylor, and it's looking really good with a fresh paint job. One of these beautiful cast iron structures that stand along here. A lot of old cast iron stuff. Here's a string of older buildings that I love and I've addressed numerous times, but in specific relation to the fire of 1873, you have the Pearn building here and the Poppleton building. These two thin buildings. I don't really know, forget the name of this structure, even though it looks like it's definitely probably 1880s. But both of these buildings were originally built, I believe, in the mid-1860s and were destroyed by the fire. Everything was destroyed through here. But most of their cast iron pieces survived the fire. So much of these buildings are built with that 1860s era cast iron structure. So almost in a way, because I think these things were finished being recreated in the mid to late 70s, I want to say. But really, in many ways, they kind of date back to the 1860s, because a lot of the pieces on these buildings are from that era. And interestingly enough, the Wakefield Glen building, which was one of the, pretty much the only building in this area for blocks around to survive, is ironically gone, because it stood here. But over here, there's three thin buildings, all built in 1878. You've got and I still never know if I'm ever pronouncing this right, but it's the Van Rensselaer building. That's how I've always said it. But there's also, I believe they're called the Harker and Love buildings. This little thin building here and this little thin building here. This is Strobridge Block, and Willamette Block is just past it over there. I know Willamette Block was built in 1882. This was probably built around that same time. They bear kind of similarities in overall structure. And yeah, most of the stuff along this stretch was built pre-1900. I know this thin little building here, Franz Block, it's actually got the construction date up on it. This little building here was built in 1878, as is noted, and this building next to it, I believe, was built in 1890. So yeah, I mean, 1890 is almost kind of new for this area. Most of it was late 1870s, because they wanted to start building right after the fire in 73, but you know, finances were tough. The panic followed by the Depression came through, and rebuilding in this area ended up taking a lot longer than was originally hoped for. But as I mentioned before, you know, one of the only buildings that survived was the Wakefield Glen building, which conveniently is not here anymore. It was demolished quite some time ago, but fortunately these older structures have managed to survive all of that. So you have a real flavor for where Portland was going in the 1870s into the 1880s by the beautiful, really, structures that took place of what was once here. So, I mean, there was something positive to come out of all this. And then Morrison's the next street down, and you can see it kind of, you're still kind of in Old Town, but a lot more newer stuff starts popping up. And yeah, it's still funny to think that the one building, and there's really not really, I've never seen an explanation for how the Wakefield Glen building, and it wasn't just that it didn't get completely destroyed, it came away practically undamaged. Which is wild considering these two buildings right next to it were completely destroyed. Everything was. You see a picture of the Wakefield Glen building, and it's just surrounded by smoldering nothingness. And it was standing there like nothing had happened. And as I always have to remember to mention, right here is where the Piern building ends. So everything on this side, this is pieces, this is actually of the Wakefield Glen building. This is the last little vestiges, last little remains of that building. I don't know if this was just lazy demolition work or if this was intentional to intentionally leave us a little piece of that which was once here when they finally did demolish it. I don't really know why this little piece was left here. Maybe it was just, they just hammered it all down and just this little piece survived and they just thought they were done and were like, good enough. God, I almost wish like one of these blocks or these bricks was loose. Like, I know I probably would get in trouble if I took one. I'd love to just get one of these bricks and keep it. I have bricks from the old United Workmen Temple that got demolished. I'd love to have one of these. And you can kind of see the, so you can tell at one point a building was up against this. There's no window. I mean, that's kind of windowy. Maybe there was a window there at one time, but it got bricked up. But yeah, this was the one spot where a building managed to survive, and everything around it got completely destroyed pretty much. However, that being said, this gray structure here on the backside of the Van Rensselaer building, this building was also here in 1873 and managed to, well, obviously managed to survive the fire. So this building hidden behind the trees was, I believe, just originally called the Northrop and Blossom building. It's now known as the Northrop, Blossom and Fitch building. And it's actually, despite the fact that it's been massively altered over the years, this is actually the second oldest commercial structure still standing in the city. Yeah, so this building was built originally in 1858 and is only predated by one other building, the Halleck Macmillan building, which I believe was, they were built within like months of each other. And this building was right down along First Avenue and Yamhill. And again, a lot of stuff got destroyed along this stretch. But this is the area where, the city managed to get more firefighters from different towns here, and they really tried to settle themselves here along the north side of Yamhill and really hold the fire right here because it had already demolished so much. It was demolishing to the south, and there were real fears about what would happen if it kept going this way because there's so many more blocks to Portland going north of here. So it really makes sense that for the most part, the fire was stopped. It didn't really process beyond the south side of Yamhill, with the exception to that being the waterfront between Front Avenue, Nadeau Parkway, and the Willamette River, where it continued to burn. That might in some ways explain why the Wakefield Glen building didn't get demolished, but again, everything else through here did.
Like so many other tragedies, it took a tragedy to finally bring about real changes in the city. One of the greatest tragedies of the whole event was that the city seemed to learn little from the fire of 1872, just months earlier. Little to no changes were made, aside from the purchase of a larger fire bell, to prepare Portland for a future event, even a fraction the size of what happened in 1873. An effort to improve the city's water system was rejected by the city under the guise of not raising taxes, or, just as well, they didn't want an increase in the city's debt. In the aftermath of an event that nearly destroyed an entire city, it should be of no surprise that these massive changes were quick to follow. In particular, the city beefed up their abilities by adding more firefighters. The days of having an exclusively voluntary fire department were to fade into the past. Regulations were also made forcing any future structures to have a core interior made of bricks as opposed to wood. By the dawn of the 1880s, the rubble of the fire had finally been lost to the past, at least visually, replaced by structures substantially more beautiful than those that preceded them. However, the commerce that once flourished there never fully returned to form. Regardless, one could walk through these many blocks that were affected and never realize how close we came to eradication. That's the general story of the events that happened on August 2nd, 1873. The fire, the fight, the panic, and the aftermath. But one question that is yet to be addressed is, why did it happen? Who started this great fire? The simple fact of the matter is, all these years later, we still don't know. This is the deeper tragedy that became of this event. When this horrible tragedy occurred, the aftermath focus seemed to be on the economical impact of the event and how it affected the Caucasian population of the area. Little concern was given to the fact that the city's Chinese population had been more affected than anyone else. And up to that point, there was no end to the racism Chinese immigrants faced in the city, with many ordinances passed, with a focus primarily on inconveniencing them. The city would often justify these ordinances as being done for the public safety. As late as June 1873, only weeks before the fire, Portland passed the Cubic Air Ordinance, requiring 550 cubic feet of air per occupant of a building, with the city knowing many Chinese lived in densely inhabited buildings, sometimes 20 people in one housing unit. More than 50 Chinese immigrants would be arrested in a 48-hour period just for violating this ordinance. Most Chinese immigrants first came to Portland as transients passing through for work, but by 1870 they were the largest ethnic group in the city. This likely bothered the Caucasian elite, who'd often refer to Chinese men as drunken loafers in a city full of alcoholic white men. In the December 1872 fire, which had started behind a Chinese laundry building, it was blamed on a worker there who was boiling pitch, which dripped down onto some wood and caught fire. That was the official story, which led to increased violence and hostility against Chinese people in the city. Again, some things never change. In the prevailing years, it's believed to be more likely that this was an arson fire, set with the objective of making these Chinese workers look responsible. And, like the 1873 fire, Chinese men were threatened into risking their lives to help fight that fire. But what about the 1873 fire? The 1872 one started next to a Chinese-run business, but the 1873 fire originated inside a furniture store run by white men. So was this another instance of arson, as everyone seemed to believe? Or was it just an accident, sparked in one building, but with the power and help to spread quickly?
While there's the slight possibility of the fire's origin being an accident, the fact that it started in the middle of the night in an establishment with many flammable items suggests otherwise. And, like the fire of 1872, I wonder if it was not incendiary in nature, with an objective of making the local Chinese population look bad. Again. At this time, Portland's Chinese people lived primarily between 2nd Avenue and the river and Ash and Salmon Streets, and the fire began at the southern edge of that area. And while many Chinese people ran their own businesses, many of them ended up working for white-owned businesses who hired them primarily because they could pay them less for their labor. This left many unemployed and transient whites in Portland jealous and hostile. And then, one night, someone slipped a note under the door of a business where a Chinese man worked, demanding they fire him or face a penalty. The author of the letter said they were one of 28 strong men who pledged to work together to eradicate Chinese employment in their community. The note in question gave the employer 2 to 3 weeks to comply or face the consequences. And this letter was delivered roughly that amount of time before the 1873 fire took place. Several other businesses hiring Chinese men also received similar letters. It is unknown if the furniture store where the fire began was one of these businesses, or if they had any Chinese workers there. These letters were also penned in red ink, something that the Ku Klux Klan was known to do. While historically the Klan did not spring up in Oregon until the 1920s, only a naive individual would presume that none of the white populace of Portland during the early 1870s, and the only U.S. state founded with a law that excluded people of color from living there, shared ideals similar to that of the KKK. So while a chapter of this dumpster fire of an abomination may not have existed in Portland in 1873, plenty of men in the city were hard-bitten racists who would assume have any persons of color removed from their city over any other alternative. The likelihood of a string of such racist documents being printed out in the ink color of the Klan without this at least being a homage to them is unlikely. And regardless of possible Klan admiration playing a role in whomever wrote these letters, the fact of the matter is we have multiple letters making threats against businesses with Chinese workers. Threats with a time of action syncing up with the great 1873 fire. It was also reported some businesses received letters after the fire, warning them once again that there was a danger in hiring Chinese men.
Further evidence that the fire may have been incendiary in nature, beyond investigators of the original fire calling it suspicious, is the fact that several individuals were seen setting other fires to keep the conflagration going. While these could have just been degenerate thrill seekers, like local papers would argue, I'm not so convinced of that conclusion. One individual was seen throwing what was described as a torpedo into an Oddfellows building. And again, while claims were made that no one died in the fire, it was reported that a man who set another fire was chased from the scene and ran into a burning building with nothing but his bones found the following morning. This may have been a somewhat exaggerated account, but it clearly implies this arsonist was killed. It was also reported that numerous individuals were arrested in relation to these other fires. In this account, someone who set a fire 6 blocks from the original was arrested and taken to jail. Who were these individuals, and what happened to them? We don't know. Could they have possibly been connected to these 28 strongmen? Well, not only were local papers quick to dismiss these other fires as being anything but the work of some thrill-seeking troublemakers, but they were also quick to dismiss the idea that the original fire was the work of this secretive group of 28 men. I wonder if these local newspapers had an objective to sweep these strong men under the rug and avoid the possible drama of it coming out that some radical racists nearly burned the whole city down just to make a point. The city had a lot to be embarrassed about. The lack of changes made after the December 1872 fire, the city's ongoing crime issues at the time, the concealed smallpox epidemic. The fire was an embarrassment almost as much as it was a tragedy. And I am of the strong opinion, like many others, that this fire was the work of these 28 so-called strongmen, whose real identities were probably an open secret in the city. If such was the case, while I cannot speak for which businesses afterward continued to employ Chinese men, it doesn't seem their objective was fully achieved. The fact that the fire began in a white-owned business, and even the other fires were caused by white people, it was hard to point a finger at the Chinese population, as opposed to the fire of 1872. Surely life for these people in Portland would continue to be fraught with struggles in the coming years, but none of that was related to this fire. And again, one of the greatest tragedies of this fire was that Chinese people were forced to do the most dangerous work in combating it, while several blocks of their community were completely destroyed in the end. There's other possibilities. For one, perhaps a disgruntled former employee at that furniture store took out revenge on it by setting it on fire. But we don't even have circumstantial evidence to argue possibilities like that. We'll probably never know for certain who was responsible for setting the fire or who the members of this 28 hateful men group were. But it's still, to this day, the greatest tragedy in the history of the city, despite its lack of casualties. But while deaths were not common, casualties of another sort befell hundreds of this city's citizens through the loss of possessions, finances, homes, and businesses, the greatest of which were faced by the city's Chinese population.